The sound of footsteps echoed sharply against the marble floor, each strike bouncing off walls draped in velvet and gilded oil paintings. Outside, snow fell thick and silent, but within the great hall of the Valois Palace, the fires roared in massive hearths, their light spilling across silk gowns and shimmering brocade cloaks. The air was heavy with the scent of red wine, jasmine perfume, and something else, an unspoken tension, the scent of schemes yet to be revealed. On the surface, the gathering was nothing more than a lavish banquet of Europe's high nobility. Courtiers exchanged smiles, raised crystal goblets, and embraced with practiced grace. But beneath the music of lutes and the swirl of dancers, quick glances darted across the room, and whispers barely audible over the hum of conversation hinted at another truth. Here, loyalty was fragile, and power was safeguarded not by friendship, but by vigilance and sometimes by the sudden, unexplained death of a rival. Mid-16th century Europe was a fractured map, wars of religion between Catholics and Protestants, dynastic rivalries over land, and brittle alliances woven through political marriages. In such a climate, a throne was not only threatened by armies at the borders, but also by a smile across the banquet table. And then, the stories began to spread. A young countess, known for her health and vivacity, collapsed just days after wearing a newly arrived gown from Florence. An Italian envoy, mid-toast, slumped forward at the feast, his hands still gloved in the softest deerskin. A French noblewoman, radiant at the ball the night before, was found lifeless in her chamber around her neck, a golden embroidered silk scarf, a gift from a longtime friend. No wounds, no daggers, no traces of poison in the wine or food, only a chilling whisper weaving its way through palace corridors. The cloth killed them. The rumor spread not only fear but a dreadful question. If a gown or a pair of gloves, the very emblems of luxury, could become a weapon, was anything in this world truly safe? From that moment, across Europe, courtly life changed. Hugs became brief, lavish fashion gifts were politely declined, and tailors once trusted artisans were eyed with suspicion. For some claimed there was a new weapon at court, poisoned garments, silent, invisible killers that could take a life with nothing more than a touch, leaving no trace behind. Life among the nobility of Renaissance Europe was a delicate performance, balanced on a knife's edge between charm and treachery. One wrong word at the wrong banquet could cost a family their lands. One miscalculated alliance could strip a noble of title, wealth, and influence. In this world, open assassination was a gamble, bloody, public, and politically dangerous. It created martyrs, stirred outrage, and often unleashed waves of revenge. But a death that appeared natural, that was far more useful. And clothing woven with gold thread, perfumed with rare oils, gifted under the guise of friendship, was the perfect Trojan horse. No sword clanged, no pistol fired, no servant fled in panic. Just a slow, invisible seep of death, concealed beneath layers of silk and civility. In the courts of France, Italy, and England, whispers of poisoned garments struck a particular chord because they preyed on the most intimate rituals of aristocratic life. Nobles did not merely wear clothing, they displayed it as a statement of wealth, lineage, and status. To accept a gift of fine attire was a gesture of trust, even intimacy. And to betray that trust through poison was the ultimate violation. The motives for such a method were as varied as the rivalries that fueled them. Political elimination. A powerful duke whose influence threatened the crown might fall ill after receiving a ceremonial cloak from a royal ally. Romantic jealousy. A spurned lover could ensure a rival never wore their wedding gown twice. Inheritance disputes. A single accident could shift entire estates from one branch of a family to another. The genius and horror of poisoned fabric was that it required no dramatic confrontation. The victim would slip the garment on in private, perhaps even alone, never suspecting that the very threads embracing their skin were the agents of their undoing. And the poisons themselves? Rumors swirled about deadly substances hidden in the dyes or soaked into the fibers. Arsenic, ground fine, mingled with powdered pigments to create brilliant greens and blues. Mercury compounds, giving a sheen to fabrics while slowly seeping through pores. Aconite, known as wolf's bane, capable of causing numbness, paralysis, and death, especially through contact with small cuts. Belladonna, whose toxins could dilate the pupils and, in higher doses, stop the heart. In the flicker of candlelight, a gown treated in such a way would appear no different from any other, perhaps even more radiant. Yet, beneath the sheen lay a danger more insidious than any blade. The fear was not limited to whispered tales. Some nobles began to refuse clothing gifts altogether, no matter how costly or symbolic. In certain courts, it became common to have garments tested before wearing, handled by servants or low-ranking attendants first, under the pretense of adjusting the fit. Of course, these attendants rarely had a choice in the matter, and their quiet disappearances only fueled the rumor mill. By the late 1500s, the concept of the poisoned garment had become a fixture in the collective imagination of Europe's elite. Whether or not it was used often or even at all, it didn't need to be. Its power lay in the uncertainty. The simple act of dressing, once a mundane luxury, had become a moment of calculation. Is this gift a gesture of alliance, or the last thing I will ever wear? And in that uncertainty, a new kind of weapon was born, one that did not need to strike to be effective. The mere suspicion of it could destabilize alliances, delay marriages, and erode the fragile trust that kept the great houses from tearing each other apart. If the idea of poisoned garments belonged only to rumor, it might have faded quietly into the background noise of courtly gossip. But the reason the legend endured and grew was because certain stories refused to die. They were whispered in embassies, retold in hunting lodges, and embroidered into the letters of foreign envoys. Some bore enough detail to feel credible, others were so theatrical that they seemed designed to terrify. One of the most persistent tales revolves around Catherine de Medici, Queen of France, wife of King Henry II. History remembers her as a skilled political operator, navigating a court fractured by religious tension. But her reputation also attracted darker rumors. According to one account, Catherine once commissioned a pair of exquisitely soft leather gloves from a renowned Florentine craftsman. These gloves, destined for a political rival, were allegedly treated with a subtle blend of arsenic and mercury salts, odorless, invisible, and deadly when worn against the skin for hours. The rival, so the story goes, fell mysteriously ill, complaining first of numbness, then violent chills, before slipping into a fatal fever. No blade was drawn, no public accusation made. The gloves disappeared, and so did the evidence. While no official record confirms this event, the story spread across Europe, cementing Catherine's image as a woman whose weapons could be as delicate as they were deadly. Then, there is the shadowy legend of the Borgia family in Italy, a name synonymous with political ruthlessness. The Borgias were accused of perfecting the art of poisoning at banquets, but in some versions of the tale, they also experimented with fabrics. A cloak gifted to a visiting diplomat, a bed canopy presented as a token of hospitality, each supposedly infused with slow-acting toxins. The appeal of such a method was obvious. When a victim died days or weeks later, far from the palace where they had been entertained, suspicion would disperse like smoke. In Russia, court whispers told of a countess whose beauty was matched only by her ambition. When her lover's affections turned toward a younger rival, she is said to have presented the woman with an opulent gown as a peace offering. The dress, embroidered with silver thread and heavy with perfume, became the talk of the winter ball. Yet within a month, the young woman was bedridden with a wasting illness that no physician could cure. Servants claimed that whenever she wore the gown, she complained of strange tingling in her arms, a creeping weakness that worsened each time. By the time she died, the countess had already secured her lover's return. Even England had its murmurs. During the reign of Elizabeth I, when Catholic plots and Protestant counterplots turned the court into a stage for espionage, a story circulated about a nobleman whose ceremonial doublet presented to him as part of a royal pageant was lined with poisoned fabric. The man collapsed during the event, and though official chronicles attributed his death to a sudden seizure, foreign ambassadors wrote in private letters of foul play wrought in the very cloth. These tales share certain patterns: the gift of clothing, the sudden illness without visible cause, the inability of physicians to diagnose, and the lack of any weapon to be found. Whether these were true assassinations, or simply the product of coincidence and paranoia, they struck at a primal fear, that the very symbols of refinement and prestige could conceal mortal danger. What made these stories even more potent was their plausibility. The poisons named in the rumors, arsenic, mercury, aconite, were known and feared. Some were already in use in cosmetics, medicines, and dyes, often in dangerous quantities even without malicious intent. A gown dyed with arsenic-laced green pigment might have been lethal simply because of fashion trends, not conspiracy. In such an environment, it became almost impossible to separate accident from design. Over time, the legends of poisoned garments took on a life of their own. Portraits of queens and duchesses were scrutinized for signs: a certain glove, a particular shade of fabric rumored to be unsafe, Gift exchanges between rival factions became rare or heavily supervised. In some courts, an informal protocol emerged. A gifted garment would be displayed for admiration, but never worn in the presence of the giver. Servants were tasked with handling the clothing first, sometimes under the guise of tailoring adjustments, while their employers watched closely for any signs of illness. The most fascinating detail? No matter how often these stories were told, they rarely included a confession or a trial. There was no smoking gun, or in this case, no incriminating stitch. The absence of proof was, paradoxically, what kept the fear alive. A dagger could be found and identified. A poison in a cup could be tested. But who could prove the guilt of a thread? By the dawn of the 17th century, the poisoned garment was less a confirmed weapon than a psychological one. Yet it had already reshaped the culture of the elite. Every handshake lingered with doubt. Every gift of clothing carried the unspoken question, is this meant to honor me or end me? Legends are powerful, but the question remains, could such a method of assassination have truly worked? To answer that, we have to step away from the candlelit halls of rumor and into the world of chemistry, toxicology, and historical evidence. Some of the poisons most often cited in these tales were indeed present in Renaissance Europe, and not just in the apothecary's back room. Arsenic was widely available, used in everything from pest control to cosmetics. Ground into a fine powder, it could be mixed with pigments to create vibrant greens and blues. Mercury was used in gilding, medicine, and even hat-making, while aconite, wolfsbane, and belladonna were known to herbalists for their potent, often lethal effects. Theoretically, if these substances were applied in sufficient quantity to fabric either woven into the threads during dyeing or absorbed into the fibers, they could harm someone through prolonged skin contact, especially if the skin was broken or irritated. Perspiration, common in the heavy, layered garments of the time, would only accelerate absorption. Aconite, in particular, is capable of causing tingling, numbness, and even cardiac arrest through contact with cuts or mucous membranes. However, science also brings sobering clarity. To deliver a fatal dose through mere contact with intact skin is far more difficult than the stories suggest. The concentration required would often leave visible residue or a distinct smell, undermining the subtlety needed for a covert attack. Moreover, many of these toxins degrade over time or lose potency when exposed to air and light. In practical terms, a poisoned gown might cause irritation, rashes, or mild systemic symptoms enough to alarm perhaps, but not always enough to kill. This is where historical context matters. Many so-called poisonings could have been the result of accidental exposure to hazardous materials already present in fabrics and dyes. Arsenic-based pigments were fashionable in the 18th and 19th centuries, but their toxic properties were not widely understood. A woman might become ill after wearing a vivid green dress, simply because the dye was dangerous in itself, not because an enemy intended it to be. In other cases, sudden illness might have had entirely unrelated causes: infectious disease, contaminated food, or even stress-induced ailments. But the lack of visible wounds made poison the most tempting explanation. And in a climate of political paranoia, no one needed hard proof for a rumor to take hold. If a rival died shortly after receiving a gift, the connection was obvious, even if it was entirely coincidental. There is also the role of psychological warfare to consider. The belief in poisoned garments may have been as valuable as the act itself. If the nobility could be convinced that such a threat existed, they would grow hesitant to accept gifts, mistrustful of friends, and wary of forming alliances. This erosion of trust could achieve political goals without a single stitch of poisoned fabric ever leaving a tailor's shop. Modern forensic analysis offers little to confirm these legends. Surviving garments from the period show no clear evidence of deliberate toxic treatment, though this is hardly surprising. Textiles are fragile, and any organic compounds applied centuries ago may have degraded beyond recognition. The absence of proof, once again, feeds the myth. Perhaps no poisoned garments have survived, or perhaps they never existed at all. In the end, science doesn't fully exonerate the past. It tells us that some forms of poisoned clothing were possible, though their lethality was likely exaggerated. But history reminds us that in a world driven by ambition, fear can be as deadly as any poison. And fear, once sewn into the fabric of courtly life, is nearly impossible to remove. In the grand tapestry of European history, the tale of poisoned garments remains a strange and shimmering thread, impossible to remove, impossible to fully confirm. It weaves together elements of truth, fragments of science, and whole cloths of rumor stitched into place by centuries of retelling. Whether or not a queen truly slipped a deadly pair of gloves into a gift box, whether a countess's gown carried more than embroidery in its seams, the stories endure because they speak to a timeless truth. In the corridors of power, the greatest dangers are rarely those in plain sight. A dagger can be parried, a cup of wine can be refused, but a gift offered with a smile, wrapped in silk, bypasses every defense except trust. And trust, in the courts of Renaissance Europe, was as rare and precious as the jewels on a royal crown. Perhaps that is why these legends have such staying power. They are not simply about murder, they are about betrayal, about the fear that beauty can be a mask for danger, that intimacy can be the prelude to destruction. The poisoned garment is less an artifact of chemistry than of human psychology, a symbol of how suspicion can seep into even the most personal acts. In our own time, the specifics have changed, but the lesson remains. Power still wears a smile, deception still dresses in finery. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing in the room is not the enemy you see, but the gift you didn't think twice about accepting. As the candlelight fades from our imagined banquet halls, we are left with a haunting image. A silk gown hanging in a wardrobe, its colors rich, its fabric flawless, its history unknowable. Was it a masterpiece of a tailor's art or a weapon, biding its time? The truth may never be certain, but perhaps that uncertainty was always the point.